Buckle your seatbelt. It's time for another episode of the Prepper Recon Podcast.
After a massive wave of disappearances, 26-year-old CIA analyst Everett Carroll finally believes what he's been told about the biblical prophecy of the rapture. Global currencies have collapsed, famine and plague have claimed the lives of millions, and the world has crumbled into chaos. 7 seals, 7 trumpets, and 7 vials of God's wrath are about to be poured out upon the earth, and woe to the inhabitants thereof. Buy your copy of The Days of Elijah, Book 1, Apocalypse, by best-selling author Mark Goodwin, in paperback or Kindle edition from Amazon.com today.
Whether your plan is to bug out or bug in, CampingSurvival.com has all of your preparedness needs, including fish antibiotics, long-term storage food, and water filters. Use coupon code PREPRECON for 5% off your order at CampingSurvival.com. This is the second half of my interview with Tom Abrams, the author of the post-apocalyptic bestseller Home. Enjoy the show. And your next series is going to be called Spaceman, and you mentioned that's post-apocalyptic, but like you said, very different. Give us a quick synopsis of that.
Sure. So Spaceman will also be 3 books, at least that's the plan right now. The first is called Spaceman, and the book begins with a coronal mass ejection, radioactive blast from the sun, hitting the International Space Station. And the hero in the book is an astronaut who is on board the International Space Station when it is damaged severely by this blast, and much of the Earth loses power. He has no communication with NASA. He's essentially ends up alone on the ISS and has to figure out his way home without any communication. At the same time, I'm telling the story of what's going on with his family on Earth. And at the beginning, his wife is alone because he's on the ISS. And when this blast hits, a plane crashes into her neighborhood, landing on houses, and there's panic, and she is forced to be a leader. So he's up on the ISS coping with what he's coping with. She's in her neighborhood trying to restore order and help people. And then their son is on a camping trip in North Texas with a friend and that friend's father, and they have to make their way back to their home, which is near Johnson Space Center. And so we have kind of 3 parallel stories all going on at the same time that are all connected, and that's book 1.
I think that's a great way to portray the details of an event, is to get multiple perspectives of different people and how their experience is different from everybody else's in relation to a specific event. I think that's really clever.
Thanks. I appreciate it. I felt like I couldn't do a whole novel just on the ISS. Despite having help from some friends who are astronauts and space weather experts, I didn't think I'd be able to fill a whole book with that. But I also felt at the same time it was important to tell what was going on Earth. And so maybe it sounds clever. It was probably just as much luck as it was anything else that it turned out that way.
And now, what have you learned in your research for that about space weather, about coronal mass ejections?
So good question. So coronal mass ejection essentially has the same effect as an electromagnetic pulse, given the right set of circumstances. Oftentimes there's going to be a warning before you'll have any sort of, they're called CMEs for short. And you'll see there will be any number of warnings throughout the network of satellites and Earth-based monitoring systems that exist that would give us a heads up if there were a CME of any significance coming. I set up a scenario where some of those systems have failed or aren't trustworthy. And so several things have to happen with a CME for it to kind of have that sort of effect, because they happen all the time. They just miss Earth. So Earth has to be in the right. It has to come off the sun at the right spot and head straight for Earth. And so those are much more rare, though they do happen. And in the past, hundreds of years ago, it wouldn't have mattered. Even a couple hundred years ago, people wouldn't really notice. But now, because of technology, that would seriously impact the way that we live our lives. And the ISS, for example, really doesn't have much in the way of radioactive shielding. It has some, but not a ton. And so if there were to be some sort of blast like that, it could seriously impact what happens on board the International Space Station. And so that's kind of the basic, without boring you too much, that's kind of how it works.
Now, if the warning systems are functioning as they should, is the space station, is it able to maneuver and speed up, slow down, whatever it needs to do to get out of the path of the CME?
Well, what they would do in that case, if they thought it was going to be bad enough, is they could, you would have a couple of days warning, right? Under normal circumstances, you would have a warning because you would know how long it would take for that CME to get to Earth based on some indicators, including solar flares and other measurements of radioactivity this close to Earth. And what they would likely do is put the astronauts who are on board, or the cosmonauts who are on board, inside the Soyuz and have them ready to leave. And so they wouldn't necessarily be exposed in the ISS the way that it happens in my book. I mean, the way it happens in the book is realistic, but it's only realistic given the circumstances that I set up. They would probably abandon the ISS if they knew without a shadow of a doubt that this sort of event would be happening. And the CME that happens in the book is much larger than anything that's happened before, which previously the largest one was called the Carrington event. But we have little CMEs happen all the time, and they're just not significant enough for us to worry about, or they miss Earth.
Yeah. The things that we're typically hit with are just, they might mess with radio signals for a day or two or something, worst case scenario so far. But it's like you said, there's these big ones going off all the time, and it's just a real big cosmic game of Russian roulette until we smack dead into one. And then it's gonna have a lot to do with how big it is, what side of the Earth is facing it when it gets hit. Lots of factors in there, but like you said, the Earth's been getting hit by these things throughout the ages, but we weren't so dependent on technology. We certainly didn't have internet and internet banking, and all our systems of support weren't dependent on electricity prior to the 1900s. So it's not something that we have experience with having this level of dependency on technology and then having it all gone.
Right. Well, and it's not, and the thing is, it's not just satellites. It's not just the power grid. It's also oil pipelines can be affected by it. Anything with metal and power that stretches over a long, area of Earth can be damaged irreparably by the kind of blast that happens in the book. And so, and it kills certain cars, and it makes transportation more difficult. So there are all sorts of things that I get to play with in that world, similar to what you'd find in the really prevalent EMP prepper books. But this is a little different in that, it's as much science fiction as it is post-apocalyptic thriller. Right.
Yeah, anything that's long and metal becomes a conductor because the CME waves are I forget, they're a couple feet wide. So anything that's long enough to catch that can suck that energy in and act like an antenna and a conduit to take it to any type of critical infrastructure and fry out the computer components on it. So yeah, big risk. That and like you said, the odds are low, but they're not zero, which means sooner or later it's going to happen. It might happen in a couple of years, or it might happen in centuries from now. But sooner or later, it has to happen.
It could. It certainly could. And I think the idea that intrigues people about post-apocalyptic fiction is the idea of what if, number one, and then I think they transpose themselves into the book and think, what would I do in this scenario? How would I survive? They're not only rooting for the character and to see how the characters survive, but I think they put themselves in the stories too. And so I know there are enough people out there who love space and love post-apocalyptic fiction that if you put the two of them together, I'm hoping it finds a decent audience.
I think that's very clever, and I think that's very. It's certainly not something that I'm aware of being already out there. So I think it's great. And back to the space weather experts and the folks that you've talked to, are there any systems in place right now that if you had warning, are there things they could do to shut the grid down to keep the power lines from acting like antennas and sucking the CME into the transformers and things to avert a more devastating event?
Well, the one thing I paid attention to was satellites, and a lot of these satellites have high and low power, and if the satellites are put on low power, they're less susceptible to the radioactive blast than if they were on high power. If they're on high power, they have more of a chance of being fried. I also think anything that's not plugged in is going to be less likely. Just like if you have a power surge from a lightning strike, anything that's not plugged in to the network is going to have a much greater chance of survival. As to whether or not there's anything they can do to the grid, that I don't know.
We're going to take a quick break, and we'll be right back. The dollar's lost over 90% of its purchasing power since 1971. Silver, on the other hand, has proven to be a very stable form of wealth preservation over the years. And where do you buy silver? Silver.com, of course. Silver.com offers fantastic prices on gold and silver. Check out silver.com today. In the new book, EMP, The End of the Grid as We Know It, by Cal Wilson, America is hit by several simultaneous EMP attacks, and the country becomes a wasteland. Jim Burkett is on a business trip when it happens. Will he make it home to his family? Buy your copy from Amazon.com and find out today. And back to home. You get pretty up close and personal with the emotions that accompany the loss of a loved one. Is that something you think the average prepper is emotionally ready to say goodbye and bury immediate family members?
That's a really good question. I don't know that anybody's ever ready for that, right? Even if you have a loved one who's been sick for a long time and you've watched them deteriorate, and the end is coming, and it's good for it to happen in terms of their suffering, you're still not ready for it. And so I think that's another element of the apocalypse, so to speak, that I think is worth writing about, and that is the pain of the immediate loss, which is what happens to Battle. He retreats from the world because he's failed his family and wants nothing to do with anybody, which is not, I think, what he expected. I think he expected to function and live a normal life with his family in the midst of whatever happened. But when they die, he doesn't know how to cope with it. And he eventually developed some odd coping mechanisms, which you learn throughout the book. But I don't know that anybody's ever ready for that, especially if you had some mass event where you lost multiple loved ones or friends. That only compounds it. And I think it makes it that much more difficult to go about the business of utilizing what it is you've prepared.
Yeah, I think that's something that a lot of folks aren't taking into account in their preparedness is, how are you going to deal with that? And another thing that Battle uses night vision in the book. How high of a priority do you think night vision would be for surviving a complete societal collapse?
Critical. Just like I think owning a gun would be, whether it's just a revolver or a shotgun or something. I think, and maybe this is the journalist in me, or maybe it's just I don't know if I'm just negative, but I believe, and I explore this in the books, that that just as much as we see the best in man during the worst of times, we see the worst of man. And that's why I think anybody needs to have whatever tools, whether it is night vision so they can see at night, because that's when you're most vulnerable, to having weapons of some kind, to having plenty of food, and to not letting people know. I think the most important thing about being a prepper is not necessarily advertising to people where you live and that you're a prepper, because then you're a target.
Yeah, very, very well said. And you mentioned that you're very vulnerable at night, but I think it was country music singer Charlie Pride who sang "The Snakes Crawl at Night," and there's a lot of truth to that. More crime occurs after dark than during daylight, so I think that really highlights the value of night vision. And being a journalist, I'm sure that's when you get most of your juicy material is after dark, right?
Right. The summertime after night when nobody has anything to do but make mistakes. I think having the ability to protect your home at night, which includes, I think, the ability to see at night when others can't see, would be critical in that sort of situation.
Yeah, I think a lot of people probably grew up with their with whatever their curfew was. A lot of people, maybe it was around 12 o'clock, and your mom and dad would say, be in before 12 because nothing good happens after 12. And I remember hearing that.
Yeah, I heard that too. And I always, we have a teenage daughter, and we tell her it's not that we're worried about you, we're worried about everybody else.
Right. And everybody doesn't have $3,500 for Gen 3 night vision scope, but for less than $1,000, you can get a decent Generation 1 scope. And if you add a $50 or $60 illuminator to that Generation 1, suddenly you've got something that's very, very comparable to Generation 2, and you can do that for less than $1,000. So, I think for a lot of folks, rather than buying 4 more guns, maybe it would be better to take the one gun that they have and make sure that they can use it 24 hours a day instead of just during daylight hours when the likelihood of it being needed is probably much less.
Yeah, and I think prepping is very personal too, right? I mean, someone who lives in Florida versus someone who lives in Texas versus someone who lives in California or in Montana, they're all going to have different needs. And some people are going to need more water than they are dry goods, and some people are going to need more ammunition than others if they live in an urban area. So I think it's all about figuring out what works for you, what is your priority, and where do you feel like you are the most vulnerable, and trying to mitigate those vulnerabilities.
Yeah, and then with the Generation 1, while it's not Generation 3 and it doesn't really function quite nearly so well, in the land of the blind, the man with one eye is king, right?
Oh, exactly. Some vision is better than no vision at all.
I listen to I'm an audiobook fan because I'm so busy. I at the computer, maybe 50, 60 hours a week. And reading most of the time I'm doing that, either my own stuff as I'm writing or what have you, or researching or whatever. So for enjoyment, it's audiobooks for me. And Kevin Pierce just did a great job with Home. I think he's absolutely the best in the business. Is he doing Spaceman, or has he done the Sedition?
Yes, he's done all my books that are in audio. He did Home, Canyon, and Wall, which is the Traveler series, and then he did Sedition and Intention. Intention just came out last month, and we've agreed to do Spaceman, which will be out in November, and the audiobook should be out at about the same time. I'm in final edits right now with Spaceman, so the narrative is done. I'm just kind of tweaking some things, and so we can expect both of them will be out the end of November, right around Thanksgiving. And Kevin does a great job. I know he introduced the two of us, and he has a unique voice that I think really fits the post-apocalyptic genre There's just a tone to his voice that I think really adds a dimension to the story that even if I were to read it, it wouldn't have.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right, and he brings life to the characters as well. Talk to us a little bit about Sedition. What's the synopsis of that?
Sure. So Sedition was the first book I published, and then for a little while I went to a traditional publisher, and then I purchased it back from them earlier this year. And it essentially tells the story of some conspirators, and it's loosely based on a real conspiracy called the Cato Street Conspiracy, which happened in England right after the death of King George, and where there was a plot to assassinate the entire cabinet. And so I basically took that idea and put it in modern day. And what happens is the president dies on the opening page of the book. There is no vice president, because even though one had been nominated, he'd not yet been confirmed. And as a result of that, there is a constitutional crisis over who should assume the presidency. And against that crisis and that power vacuum, a group of co-conspirators decide that they're going to take control and set about this plot to try and change the course of the government. While they're doing that, there is a mid-level NSA analyst who is tasked with monitoring these people. And she comes across some things that lead her to think what they're going to do is much bigger than what the NSA believes they're going to do. And she has a hard time convincing people of that. So that's the plot that happens in Sedition, is this conspiracy to overthrow the government and something large in the way of a terrorist attack that these men want to perpetrate on their own people. And they see themselves as patriots rather than terrorists. So it's interwoven. It takes place in Washington, D.C. The Capitol itself is almost another character in the book, the way I try to write it, with some historical context and lessons in our history as they relate to our founding fathers. And so that's Sedition. And Tension is the sequel to that book that takes place months later after the end of the first book, when you learn that the conspiracy in Sedition was only the beginning of a much larger global conspiracy that takes place in the second book.
Oh, that sounds very, very entertaining, and I'm looking forward to that one as well. And you mentioned Spaceman. That's going to be out right before Thanksgiving then?
Yes, that'll be out November 22nd is the date, and we should hit it no problem. And then the sequel to that, Descent, will be out first quarter of next year. And then I'm also writing in Nicholas Smith. He's written the Extinction. Sorry about the phone ringing.
It's all right.
He's written the Extinction Cycle series of books, and he's got a Kindle World coming out, and asked me to write a book for that. So that's what I'm finishing right now. So I have that coming out in next month, and then Spaceman in November, and then I'll come up for air maybe. And
then what's the best place to find all your books?
Sure. You can go to Amazon, type in my name, Tom Abrams, Abrahams, or you can go to my website, tomabramsbooks.com, TOMABRAHAMS, like abrahamsbooks.com, and you can find links to everything there.
Well, Tom, thanks so much for producing some really good, clean entertainment. There's so many of us out here that really, really appreciate the effort that you put in that and making something that's not just full of filth. And thanks for making time to come on the show today.
Hey, Mark, I really appreciate it. Always a pleasure, and I look forward to seeing more great work from you too.
Trading Post in the Woods is ran by veteran crisis responders who know how important it is to be prepared. They specialize in comprehensive natural survival remedy kits, preparedness and homesteading supplies, as well as skills training. Visit them online today at tradingpostinthewoods.com.
Get prepared before disaster strikes. PrepperRecon.com offers MOLLE-compatible individual first aid kits for your home, auto, or bug-out bag. These kits have everything you need to address a traumatic injury, including an Israeli battle dressing, quick clot, EMT shears, suture kit, steri-strips, tourniquet, tough strip bandages, and so much more. $99 includes shipping. Go to PrepperRecon.com and click the Store tab at the top of the home page. Order today before it's